morning of May 23rd, 2011, after the tornado had passed, only one barn was left standing in all of Garrison County. It was the one built by Silas Miller, the one everyone had called a joke. It stood on its hill, a dark, solid shape against a bruised sky, surrounded by a landscape of splinters and ruin. Let me tell you about that barn. The story begins 2 years earlier, in the spring of 2009. Silas Miller was 72 years old, had farmed the same 480 acres for 55 of those years, and was known for two things: the unwavering straightness of his cornrows and a silence that could outlast winter. His barn, the one his great-grandfather Elias Miller had raised in 1888 with a team of oxen and the help of 12 neighbors, was dying. The main tie beam, a colossal piece of hand-hewn oak, had developed a crack that ran 14 feet long and 3 inches deep. The county inspector, a young man with a clipboard and no sense of history, had tagged it with a red condemnation notice on April 17th. The notice gave him 90 days. Silas stood inside the old structure, the light filtering through the gaps in the siding like dust-filled columns in a cathedral. He ran a hand over the rough surface of the beam. It was warm from the afternoon sun. For 121 years, this building had been the heart of the farm. It had held hay, cattle, machinery, children playing in the loft, and the accumulated weight of 5 generations of Millers. Now its spine was broken. His grandson Ben stood beside him. Ben was 22, fresh out of the state university with a degree in agricultural business and a belief in spreadsheets. He saw the red tag not as a death sentence, but as an opportunity, an inefficiency to be corrected. He said, "Granddad, it's time. We knew this was coming." Silas didn't answer. He was listening to the barn, to the groan of the timbers, the whisper of the wind through the chinks. These were sounds he had known his entire life. To him, they were a language. The barn was saying it was tired. Ben pulled out his phone. "I've been looking at some options. There's a company, AgriBuild Solutions. They can put up a 60 by 120 steel truss pole barn in 3 weeks. Concrete floor, metal siding, fully wired. Certified for 110 mile-per-hour winds. It's a clean slate. Efficient." Silas finally turned his gaze from the beam to his grandson. His eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky. He held up a hand, calloused and mapped with the lines of a long life. In that hand, he held a single hand-forged 4-inch spike he'd pulled from a floorboard. It was square, not round, and its head was hammered into an irregular shape. "They don't make them like this anymore," he said. He didn't say it with sadness. He said it as a statement of fact, like noting the time of day. Ben nodded, a little too quickly. "I know. That's the point. We can get something better now, stronger, faster, cheaper too." He had the numbers ready. He'd run the amortization schedules. The AgriBuild barn, installed and finished, would cost $72,500. A 15-year loan at 4.8% interest. The tax depreciation benefits alone made it a smart move. Silas closed his hand around the old spike. "No," he said. "I'll build the new one myself." That was the beginning of it. The beginning of the joke. Silas Miller, at 72, was going to build a timber frame barn. Not a pole barn with posts sunk in the ground and trusses holding up a roof. A proper barn, the way Elias Miller had built one. with a stone foundation, massive posts and beams, and joints cut by hand. Ben argued. He showed his grandfather the spreadsheets, the cost analysis, the sheer impracticality of it. To source, mill, and season the kind of timber Silas was talking about would take years. The labor would be immense. Silas just listened, his patience a deep well. When Ben was finished, Silas walked over to the old farmhouse, a place that had stood on its own foundation since 1870. He came back not with a blueprint, but with two objects. The first was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth and its pages yellowed. The second was a felling axe, its head a dark, heavy wedge of steel, its hickory handle shaped by the grip of his father and his father before him. "This is the plan," Silas said, holding up the journal. "And this is the machine." He rested the axe head on a block of wood. The edge was still sharp enough to shave with. It hadn't been used in 40 years, but every winter Silas had taken it down, cleaned it, oiled the handle, and run a stone along its edge. It was a ritual, an inheritance. Let me tell you about the journal. It was started in 1885 by Silas Miller, who had come to Garrison County from Pennsylvania. He was a carpenter by trade before he was a farmer. He had learned the old ways of joining wood, a craft that was already dying out in the face of mass-produced nails and sawmills. In the journal, in a precise, elegant script, Elias had detailed the geometry of a mortise and tenon joint. He had drawn diagrams of king post trusses and explained the mathematics of calculating load-bearing capacity. But he had written about more than just technique. He had written about the wood itself. "White oak," he wrote, "for the posts that meet the earth, for it resists the rot. Pine for the rafters, for it is light and strong. Black locust for the pegs that join the timbers, for it is harder than the oak and will swell with the seasons, tightening the joint until it is stronger than the wood itself." He wrote about patience. "Let the timbers season for 2 years. Let them check and twist. The wood must finish its movement before you ask it to hold up a roof for a century." This was what Silas intended to do. It was, to Ben and everyone else who heard about it, a form of madness. A beautiful, noble, but utterly impractical madness. The first step was the trees. Silas owned a 40-acre woodlot on the back end of his property, a patch of land his family had never cleared. It was full of old-growth white oak. For 2 weeks, Silas walked that woodlot, not with the axe, but with a can of blue paint. He marked 28 trees. He knew them not just as timber, but as individuals. He knew which ones had grown straight and true in competition for the sun, and which had been battered by old storms. He chose the strong ones. In the fall of 2009, he and Ben, reluctantly, felled the trees. They used a modern chainsaw, a concession to the 21st century that Silas made without comment. But the work of limbing and sectioning the logs was done with the old felling axe. Silas's swings were not powerful, but they were economical. Each one landed with a deep, satisfying thud, exactly where he intended. He was not fighting the wood. He was having a conversation with it. He hired a man with a portable sawmill to come and cut the logs into beams. The specifications were from the journal. The main posts were to be 10 inches by 10 inches square, the tie beams 8 inches by 12, the rafters 6 by 8. The sawyer, a man named Frank, who had been milling lumber his whole life, shook his head as the massive, pale timbers came off the saw. "Nobody builds like this anymore, Silas," he said, wiping sawdust from his face. "This is overkill. You could build a bridge with this." Silas just nodded. "That's the idea." The timbers, 152 of them in total, were stacked in the field next to where the new barn would stand. They were separated by spacers to allow the air to circulate. And there they sat. For all of 2010 and into 2011, they sat through the snows of 2 winters and the baking sun of a summer. Silas would walk out to the stacks every few days and just look at them. He was letting them finish their movement. Meanwhile, the rest of Garrison County was moving on. In the summer of 2010, Dale Covington arrived. He was 38 years old, the regional sales manager for AgriBuild Solutions, and he was the very picture of modern confidence. He drove a new Ford F250, wore crisp polo shirts with the company logo, and carried an iPad full of testimonials and 3D renderings. He was not a bad man. He was a true believer. He believed in progress, in efficiency, in helping farmers improve their bottom line. He was wrong, not because he was malicious, but because his knowledge was an inch deep and a mile wide. He held a meeting at the county Grange Hall. Nearly every farmer in a 50-mile radius was there. He put up a presentation on a projector screen. It showed charts of rising labor costs, graphs of construction times, and pictures of gleaming, identical steel barns. He spoke with an easy, practiced charm. "Folks, your time is your money. Your grandfather had the time to spend a year building a barn. You don't. You've got crops to manage, markets to watch, books to keep. You need a tool, not a monument. Our structures are engineered tools. They go up in weeks, not years. They're built with high-tensile American steel. They're rated for 110-mile-per-hour winds and a 40-pound snow load. They come with a 25-year warranty, and we can have you under a new roof for under 80 grand. It was a compelling argument. The logic was undeniable. Farming was a business of tight margins and relentless pressure. A barn was a capital expenditure. You wanted the best return on your investment. After the presentation, Dale walked the room, shaking hands, answering questions. He saw Silas sitting in the back, his hands folded in his lap. He walked over, extending a hand. "Dale Covington, AgriBuild. I don't believe we've met." "Silas Miller." Silas shook his hand. His grip was firm, dry. "I hear you're putting up a new barn yourself, Mr. Miller. Old school timber frame, is that right?" Dale's smile was genuine. He had an appreciation for hobbyists. Silas nodded. "That's a beautiful craft," Dale said. "A real art form. But from a business perspective," he tapped his iPad, "I can save you $100,000 and 2 years of your life." Silas looked at the screen Dale was showing him. It was a rendering of a red steel barn, perfect and sterile. Then he looked at Dale. "Your buildings," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "They're held together with screws." "That's right," Dale said proudly. "Grade 8, self-tapping, zinc-coated fasteners. We use over 5,000 of them in a standard build. The engineering is state-of-the-art." "A screw holds things together with friction," Silas said. "It fights the wood, or the steel. It's a battle. A good joint doesn't fight. It transfers the load. It turns the whole building into one piece." Dale's smile tightened just a fraction. He was used to dealing with objections about price or scheduling, not philosophy. "Well, our engineers in Omaha have run the numbers. They're strong enough. We've got thousands of these barns all over the Midwest. They stand up. Silas nodded again, a slow, deliberate motion. For now. Over the next 6 months, 9 new agri-built barns went up in Garrison County. They rose out of the cornfields with astonishing speed. A concrete crew would come 1 week, and by the end of the next, a crane would be lifting steel trusses into place. The week after that, crews of men in harnesses would be scurrying over the roofs, driving screws with pneumatic guns that whined from dawn till dusk. The farmers would stand and watch, marveling at the efficiency. They felt smart. They had made a sound business decision. And on the Miller farm, the stack of oak timbers just sat. Every so often, a neighbor would drive by, slow down, and shake his head. Some of them started calling it Silas's Folly. The pile of wood became a local landmark, a symbol of an old man refusing to get with the times. The joke was Silas was building the most expensive firewood pile in the state. Ben felt the embarrassment keenly. At the feed store, at church, people would ask him with a little smirk how his granddad's barn was coming along. He'd try to defend them, talking about heritage and quality, but the words sounded thin even to his own ears. He'd go home and argue with Silas again. "Granddad, people are laughing at you, at us." Silas would be in his workshop, sharpening a chisel or laying out a joint on a piece of scrap wood. He'd look up from his work. Let them laugh. Laughing is easy. Building is hard. In the spring of 2011, the timbers were ready. They had dried for 18 months. Silas walked the piles, inspecting each one. They were no longer perfect square-cut beams. They had developed checks, small cracks on the surface. Some had a slight twist to them. To an outsider, they looked flawed. To Silas, they were now stable. They had finished their movement. Let me tell you about the joinery. This was the heart of the barn, the part that no one would ever see, but the only part that truly mattered. Silas didn't use blueprints. He used a tool called a framing square and a set of ratios from his great-grandfather's journal. The system was called square rule layout. It assumed the timbers were imperfect. It didn't try to make them perfect. It established a reference plane within each timber and measured all cuts from that plane. It was a system that embraced imperfection to create a perfect whole. For 2 months, Silas and Ben worked. Or rather, Silas worked, and Ben, having finally surrendered, helped. They used handsaws, chisels, and mallets. Silas would scribe a line with a knife, creating a razor-thin guide. Then he would saw down to the line, his strokes steady and true. He would chop out the waste with a chisel, the sharp steel slicing through the oak with a sound like tearing silk. They cut mortises, square holes, into the posts. They cut tenons, tongues of wood, on the ends of the beams. Each joint was a mirror image of the other, a puzzle piece designed to fit its mate and no other. They were cutting hundreds of them. It was slow, repetitive, exhausting work. The air filled with the scent of fresh-cut oak. Ben, who had spent 4 years learning about futures markets and commodity pricing, found a strange rhythm in the work. He learned the difference in the sound of a sharp chisel and a dull one. He learned how to read the grain of the wood, to know which way it would split. He began to understand. He wasn't just cutting wood. He was building a relationship with it. He was learning the language Silas had spoken his whole life. One afternoon, Dale Covington drove by. He saw them working in the field, surrounded by the massive, jointed timbers laid out on the ground like the bones of a whale. He stopped his truck and walked over. He was wearing a new, brighter polo shirt. Business was good. "Still at it, I see," he said, his tone a mix of pity and amusement. Silas looked up from a mortise he was cleaning out. He didn't say anything. "You know, Silas," he said, leaning against a 40-foot tie beam, "I admire your work ethic. I truly do. But my barn over at the Johnson place has been holding hay for 8 months now. It's already paid for a third of itself in storage rental fees." He gestured at the timbers. "This is just a cost." "You see a cost," Silas said, wiping his brow. "I see a savings account." Dale chuckled and shook his head. He got back in his truck and drove away. He had a sales call over in the next county. AgriBuild was expanding their territory. Let me tell you about the pegs. The journal was very specific about them. They were to be made of black locust, a wood so dense and rot-resistant that old-timers used it for fence posts because it would outlast the wire. The pegs, or trunnels, were not to be perfectly round. They were to be octagonal, hand-carved with a draw knife. And they were to be seasoned until they were bone dry. The holes drilled in the mortise and tenon, however, would be slightly offset. This was the secret. When the dry, 8-sided peg was driven through the slightly misaligned holes of the green oak, it would pull the joint together with immense force. The shoulders of the tenon would be drawn tight against the post. Then, over the years, as the great oak timbers slowly seasoned and shrank, the locust peg would absorb ambient moisture from the air and swell. The joint wouldn't get looser. It would get tighter. It was a technology that grew stronger with age. It was alive. A screw, on the other hand, only ever gets looser. The barn raising was on May 14th, 2011. It wasn't like the old days. There were no oxen. Silas had hired a crane for the day. But the community came. About 50 people. They came mostly out of curiosity. They wanted to see the final act of Silas's folly. Dale Covington was there too. He stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, watching. The frame went up in a single day. The massive bents, cross-sections of the barn, each consisting of 2 posts, a tie beam, and rafters, had been pre-assembled on the ground. The crane would lift a 4,000-pound bent into the air, and Silas and Ben, standing on the foundation, would guide it into place. Other men would slide the connecting girts and plates into their mortises. Then came the moment of truth. Ben would hold a locust peg over the hole. Silas, wielding a ridiculously oversized wooden mallet he called the Commander, would take a swing. The sound of the locust peg being driven into the oak was not a crack, but a deep, resonant thud that echoed across the fields. Thud. 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 With each blow, the complex joint pulled itself together, becoming a single, immovable object. By the end of the day, the skeleton stood, a cathedral of wood against the setting sun. It looked ancient and modern at the same time. Its lines were clean, its geometry perfect. The people who had come to smirk stood in silence. It was undeniably beautiful. It was also, they thought, ridiculously overbuilt. Frank, the sawyer, clapped Silas on the shoulder. "Well, Silas," he said, grinning, "I'll say one thing. God himself could throw a hurricane at this thing and it wouldn't budge." It was meant as a joke. No one was laughing a week later. The storm came on May 22nd. It started in the late afternoon. The sky turned a color no one had ever seen before, a sickening shade of greenish black. The weather radio started screaming about a PDS, a particularly dangerous situation. A large, violent tornado was on the ground, tracking northeast, directly toward Garrison County. The sirens started to wail at 5:32 p.m. Silas and Ben were in the farmhouse. They went to the cellar, just as Silas's father had taught him. The old storm cellar was made of stone, with a heavy oak door. They could hear the wind begin to rise, a low moan that quickly escalated into a shriek. And then came a sound that no one who has heard it can ever properly describe. The sound of a freight train. But it wasn't just a sound. It was a physical presence. The air pressure dropped so suddenly that their ears popped. The ground vibrated. The little house shook on its foundation. It lasted for 14 minutes. And then, silence. A profound, unnatural quiet. They waited another 20 minutes before opening the door. When they came out, the world was gone. Or rather, it had been rearranged into an unrecognizable chaos. Their house was still standing, though it had lost most of its shingles and all of its windows. But the landscape, it was flattened. Trees were stripped bare, snapped in half like twigs. Fields were scoured down to the mud. Of their neighbors' houses, only foundations remained. And the barns? The 9 new, efficient, state-of-the-art agri-build barns that had dotted the county were simply gone. Not damaged. Gone. Scraps of twisted metal and shredded siding were strewn for miles. Silas and Ben walked slowly toward the hill where the new barn stood. They were afraid of what they would find. The path was blocked by debris, including the crumpled remains of their neighbor's grain silo. When they finally cleared the rise, they stopped. It was there. The roof was missing some shingles. The siding on the west side was peppered with holes from flying debris. But the frame was untouched. It stood square and true on its foundation, unbowed. It hadn't moved an inch. The sun rose on a field of splinters and one standing barn. The final number from the National Weather Service was an EF5. Winds had been clocked at over 200 miles per hour. The agri-build barns, certified for 110, had not just failed. They had been annihilated. They had come apart at the seams, the thousands of little screws losing their frictional grip in the violent, oscillating pressure, the lightweight steel trusses kiting away like paper. The structures designed to be built quickly had also been designed to come apart quickly. It wasn't a flaw. It was an intrinsic part of their design. In the days that followed, a slow parade of trucks and cars made its way down the Miller's Lane. The community witnesses, the other farmers, the ones who had bought the promises of speed and efficiency. They didn't come to talk. They just came to look. They would park their trucks, get out, and stare at the barn on the hill. They would look at the massive oak posts, at the way the beams were locked together. They would look at it for a long time, their faces grim. Then they would get back in their trucks and drive away. It was a silent, county-wide admission, a shared, unspoken understanding of a fundamental mistake. Dale Covington's phone rang for a week straight. Angry, desperate farmers. He had to tell each of them the same thing. The 25-year warranty had a clause, page 14, subsection C. It didn't cover acts of God. A 200-mile-per-hour tornado was an act of God. AgriBuild Solutions was legally and financially in the clear. Dale delivered the news with a hollow voice. His certainty was gone, replaced by something else, something that sounded like shame. He resigned his position 2 months later. No one in Garrison County ever saw him again. About a week after the storm, Ben was helping his grandfather board up the broken windows on the house. He was quiet for a long time. Then he stopped, his hammer in his hand. "Granddad," he said, "I was wrong. All that time I was looking at your barn and seeing the cost, the time, the inefficiency. I never saw the value." Silas stopped his own work. He looked at his grandson. The boy's face was full of a new, hard-won understanding.
"It's not your fault," Silas said. "You were taught to see the world in numbers on a page. Some things you can't measure in a spreadsheet." "What was it?" Ben asked. "What did you know?" Silas walked over to the edge of the yard, where a piece of twisted steel siding from a neighbor's barn lay wrapped around a shattered tree stump. He nudged it with his boot. That fella, Dale, he was selling them a roof. That's all they thought they were buying. A quick way to keep the rain off the hay. He turned and looked up at his barn, its frame dark and solid against the sky. "We weren't building a roof. We were building a foundation. We were building a connection to the ground. This barn isn't held down by bolts. It's held down by its own weight. It's held together by its own geometry. It doesn't fight the wind, it ignores it. It is too busy holding itself together." He picked up a handful of locust pegs from a canvas bag on the porch. He handed one to Ben. It was smooth, dense, and surprisingly heavy. The world is obsessed with what is fast and cheap and easy. But what is fast is forgotten. What is cheap is broken. What is easy is not worth having. What survives is not what is strongest, but what is most committed. That barn is committed to being a barn. Every piece of it has only one job: to transfer its load to the piece next to it, and ultimately, to the earth. It's not a collection of parts. It's a single thing. That barn is still standing today. Silas Miller passed away in his sleep 4 years after the storm, at the age of 78. Ben runs the farm now. He has 2 children of his own. On winter evenings, he takes them to the workshop and shows them how to sharpen a chisel. He has them hold their great-great-great-grandfather's journal, and he tells them the story of the wood and the pegs and the storm. He tells them that some things are not meant to be efficient. They are meant to endure. What is rigid breaks. What is flexible is torn apart. But what is integrated, what is joined, what is designed with patience and an understanding of the forces not just of today, but of the next 100 years, that is what remains.